forgot.
Okay, let's.
Okay, we're going.
Hopefully that's working.
Yes, I see that it says recording, so I think we should be good.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is just an overview of the research kind of going on in my group. Like I said, which, sort of recently, I guess you could say, rebranded as the ENDS Lab, which stands for Electronic and Neuromorphic Devices and Systems, which I felt like was sort of fitting given the sort of broad nature of what we've sort of been doing, which has ranged ranged from like semiconductor device fabrication in the clean room and characterization, and even some neural interface work and electrophysiology work, all the way to really circuits and systems that are like electronic spiking neural networks and machine learning. So that's mostly kind of what we're doing nowadays, and that's mostly what I'm going to focus on and kind of talk about. So just a quick overview of my research group. I just like to slap some pictures up there because I always like to show that, we try to work hard and do a lot of presentation of our research to kind of get the word out there, but we also like to try and have fun. So usually, we in non-COVID times get to go to a lot of different conferences and visit a lot of cities and get to meet a lot of other researchers from various places around the world. Just to give you a sort of idea, right now I have 2 undergraduate students who do research in my group, Kyle Kramer and Nate Fisher. And then I have, I've had some Ph.D. students, Sepida Rastegar, who's at Micron now, Sumedha Dal, who's also at Micron. Robert Ivans is actually still a grad student getting his doctorate, but has transitioned to a fellowship at Idaho National Lab. So he's living over in Idaho Falls now and should graduate in the next year or so. And then 2 fairly newer students, Ben Echeverry, who got his undergrad degree at Boise State. Some of you may know him. He's a couple years older though, graduated a couple years ago, and Farhana Afrin. So, those are some of the students that have kind of come through my group, and traditionally I've had a lot more undergraduates. Right now, having only 2 is actually sort of a smaller number for me. So if you're interested in research and interested in any of this, definitely just let me know, and we can talk more about what opportunities I might, be able to offer.
Yeah, we can probably send that on an email if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, I would like people who are specifically interested in that area, but yeah, maybe we can definitely, we can talk about that later. I mean,
okay.
I probably have space maybe for 1 or 2, maybe 2 more, depending on how things, shake out. But anyway, that's kind of a, background of just kind of who my group is, who we are, and I've skipped the funding acknowledgement kind of stuff because I don't think any of you care about that. But I usually like to acknowledge the agencies that give us the grant money to be able to do this, which right now is National Science Foundation and the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, which is part of the Department of Defense. And then I've had also before money from Air Force Office of Scientific Research and some other places too. So the main focus of the group, obviously, I said electronic and neuromorphic. And what does that mean? Well, it's a word that basically means that we're trying to build electronics that behave like the brain. And so first of all, I thought it would be appropriate to talk a little bit about the brain. A lot of engineers, especially electrical engineers, don't necessarily have to take any biology, although you may know something about biology from high school or whatever. But it's, I think, good to give a little bit of background on it. So basically, you have all these cells in your brain called neurons, and your brain actually works electrically. It's almost like an electrochemical circuit, and you have all these cells called neurons that sort of integrate up charge in the form of ions that come into the cell. And once the charge reaches a certain point, certain threshold, they actually fire a little voltage spike, right? So they communicate with these, somewhere between 50 and 100 millivolt magnitude voltage pulses. And they propagate those voltage pulses through the cell and then they branch out through all these basically what are like essentially wires, and then connect to other cells. And so the synapses are connections between two neurons, and these are the actual places where a cell that has an action potential will release some kind of neurotransmitter into the next cell, and you know, excite that cell closer to its threshold to fire. And all these connections, actually, the strength of those connections changes, and it's what we call the synaptic weight. And it depends on sort of the activity of the cells that those synapses connect, and that activity could be firing rate, or it could be the timing of the spikes between the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. So that's kind of the basic way that things work. You have just electrical pulses that travel and propagate throughout the cells, you know, one cell to another, and it sort of fans out. Now, the huge difference between the way the brain works and a traditional computer is that the fan out is orders of magnitude larger. So in the brain, the number of synapses per neuron, or the number of other neurons that one neuron will connect to, is like usually around at least 1,000, so up to 10,000. Whereas in, you know, your normal integrated circuit, your fan out is less than 10 usually, right? Like a single transistor or an inverter or a logic gate can only drive a couple more logic gates. So there's a huge disparity in sort of the interconnectivity of these computing elements. You know, the other thing is power consumption is also incredibly different. The brain actually uses only about 10 watts of power. It's less than a typical light bulb, but it can do some amazing computational things. Whereas, you know, even your laptop is using usually at least 100 watts if it's doing like a relatively intense computational task. And I put that as watts per centimeter squared because, you know, usually we do this by area. That's about the maximum amount of power you can dissipate just by air cooling in your PC, let's say. So the other thing about the brain, and this is like all the motivation for trying to pursue, you know, brain-inspired or bio-inspired electronics, is that it's incredibly defect tolerant, right? We have cells and neurons that die all the time and that regrow, and the connections change over time. And it doesn't really significantly impact our ability to process information, sensory information, things like that. But if you lose a transistor or a logic gate inside the processor of your computer, you're dead in the water oftentimes, right? It'll pretty much make it unable to operate. So these two things down here at the bottom, power consumption and reliability, are incredibly different between digital computers and the brain. And the brain just generally outperforms digital computers on any real world tasks where it involves, you know, streaming sensory information and things like that. So there's a motivation. And I should say, you know, you all can feel free to interrupt me at any time and ask questions if you do have them. So here's a little bit about how we're building learning machines, right? And I'm sure you've heard a lot about deep learning, machine learning, and all of this, and it's really interesting stuff. It mostly happens in software that's running on a digital computer, right? Maybe it's supercomputers even running custom programs. Although these days they're not so custom. You can do TensorFlow or Keras or something like that, and you know, usually, but it's just extremely power intensive because the digital electronics are not optimized to doing those kind of tasks. So one thing you can do is sort of create some customized hardware and combine some customized software together, just using your normal transistors, but just reconfiguring how the circuits operate in order to make it more power efficient, which is what a lot of people are currently doing. And so that is really like the home, the bread and butter of neuromorphic electronics. And then you can also go maybe even farther and say, okay, let's use some non-traditional components, things called memristors, devices called memristors, or even some types of memory transistors, or there are various types that I'll talk about later, and really make this very customized, very specific hardware that has ultra low power consumption, because we're using these components that have the right properties at the physical level. And those kind of areas are roughly where my group sort of focuses. really somewhere between these non-traditional devices and components up into, sort of the hybrid approach where we're building customized hardware out of traditional, very large scale integrated circuits, or VLSI. Okay. So I mentioned that the synaptic weights and the way that these networks learn sort of depends on the activity of neurons. And I wanted to show a little bit about these learning rules, and just with a fun kind of little animation where I've taken, 2 neurons feeding into one output neuron. And I've circled here the points of the synapses, the connections between those neurons, right? The thing to remember is these voltage pulses are, it's digital in voltage. Every action potential generated by a neuron looks the same, generally speaking, but they can occur at any time. So it's not clocked, right? It's an asynchronous type of information transmission. And if we have these 2 input neurons that fire an action potential at different times, so one goes and then the other goes, you'll notice that output neuron didn't spike. Okay, because it wasn't sufficiently excited to reach its threshold. And now I've circled those synapses in yellow, meaning, well, it probably decreased the weight or made the connection weaker because those 2 input cells fired, but it didn't cause the output to fire. So alternatively, we can say, what if both of these, say, fire at basically the same time, and then they excite the output and the output fires a spike? Now what probably happens is that these synapses actually strengthen the connection. So the synaptic weight increases. And in neuroscience, this has kind of been understood for quite some time now. And they say colloquially that cells that fire together wire together, and cells out of sync lose their link. Okay. And so these are these activity dependent learning rules, and that change the strengths of these synaptic connections. And ultimately, that's kind of what allows us to learn and remember and think. So how do we build this in real electronics? Let's look at it sort of from the perspective of more IEEE type people, right? You have an input neuron, and you have a synapse, and then you have an output neuron. So I've just redrawn this and made it look less biological. And one way that we can, sort of change the strength of those electrical connections is basically just through resistors, right? Or variable resistors. And so I've sort of indicated that kind of with a variable resistor symbol. So that's one of the main kind of areas of focus. So let's go into some neuron and synapse implementations of circuits and devices, and sort of start with the neurons. There are many different types of neurons in the brain, actually. There's dozens of different types. And there's certain circuits that will implement each of those sort of little variations in electronics. But it turns out the vast majority of neurons in the brain are of the type that we call leaky, integrate, and fire, which means they do exactly what I described earlier. They sort of sum up all of the current coming in to the neuron, and if the amount of current and charge reaches a certain threshold, well, then they fire an output spike and they reset themselves back to 0, basically. And at the same time, they sort of leak off a little bit of charge through the cell membrane as they're integrating. So they call it leaky, integrate, and fire. And there's different ways to actually build these kind of circuits. The first one was actually proposed way back in the 80s, late 80s, by Carver Mead, who was at Caltech, who is sort of as we call, the father of neuromorphic engineering. And the way this works is you'd have all these input synapses, which basically look like resistors, right? And you have current flowing into this feed node. And normally, under just normal conditions, this MOSFET is on. So it conducts all this current and integrates it on this capacitor C1, which is much like the capacitance of the cell membrane inside of the neuron cell biologically. And then, of course, when this input node reaches the threshold, this inverter, this first inverter formed, at the beginning here, this thing fires, right, and feeds back this signal, which then resets, basically pull all the charge off of that capacitor, you know, back to ground and resets itself. Okay, so this is sort of an easy leaky integrate and fire implementation. This is the one we primarily use, but the challenge with it is this input node, right? As the charge is building up and the voltage builds up, your input node actually is changing voltage, right? So as you pump charge onto the node, onto the capacitor, the voltage builds up on the capacitor. And so the potential felt by these sort of resistors on this node actually changes. It's not set at ground. And that can be advantageous, and sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, right? It just depends on what kind of task you're trying to perform. So the other way to do this obviously would be with, like, you know, go to circuits 2 and learn about your leaky integrator op amp. And so you can slap an op amp in here, and here's your, you know, pre-synapses, your input synapses. This charge goes onto this node here, right? Something like this. And then you've got a capacitance, it's the membrane capacitance from the inverting node to the output, et cetera, right? And this node basically sits at virtual ground, okay? As you would know from basically, you know, circuits 1 and 2. And so then it doesn't change the potential, but it's still able to integrate the incoming charge from all of those synapses. So these are kind of a couple implementations. And like I said, we predominantly use the one on the left. So here are some actual results from building these circuits that are a lot that are like the one on the left. This based on this Carver-Mead design. This is one we actually built. I actually built in my Ph.D. Made out of thin film transistors. And so you've actually got these these guys that are big pads where we put microprobes onto to test, and then you can see where the transistors are right here. Like these are the 2 inverters that are back to back, and then there's actually some capacitors that form the feedback, and then you've got a ground and VDD, and then you've got the leakage capacitor here, and these things actually worked using thin film transistors made out of amorphous silicon. You know, you could basically say, okay, if I input a current of, you know, somewhere between up to a nanoamp or so, the spike frequency is, you know, 0 to 150 hertz, okay, which is really slow. You're like, wait, you know, this doesn't make any sense, but this is how biology operates. The brain and the firing rates of neurons in the brain maximally are usually 200 hertz. They never go above that. Super slow, but super interconnected, okay? So it's nothing like a digital computer that runs with a clock in the gigahertz range, okay? And these input currents are also extremely small, right? Because you're dealing with actual movement of ions, which is not going to deliver a whole lot of charge. So we can also do these things in CMOS. So in you know, traditional, you know, crystalline silicon devices, transistors. This is 310 stuff. Here's a picture of one of the chips that we had fabricated by the MOSIS service, which is metal oxide semiconductor implementation service. Okay, so they're like what we call a foundry, where we create the design, we send it off to them. They take a whole bunch of people's designs and then run a process on silicon wafers, and then cut them up and deliver all the pieces to all the people who ordered them. So we can do that and see the same kind of a thing. You know, this is the green shows an actual biological neuron. The other curves are for the different sort of designs of neuron circuits that we had on the actual CMOS chip. So that it runs a little bit faster, but it's hard to go slow in CMOS. So here's some actual use cases. We also have like discrete component type neuron circuits. You know, basically this is what they do, right? I'm going to show, let's see, the blue is the signal that's actually applied as the input. And you would expect that when the input magnitude is larger, this thing fires a lot faster, right? It's a magnitude of input versus a frequency, spike frequency sort of correlation. And so that's exactly what you see. I've got a lot of traces on here, but you don't have to think about anything other than this blue curve at the top. which is basically the piecewise linear sort of input, and the output on the blue curve at the bottom, which is like there's a spike and a spike. And then you can see between about 0.01 and 0.02 seconds, the input is fairly low and the thing doesn't spike. And then it starts to creep up again between 0.02 and 0.03 seconds. And so now you're going to start getting a faster frequency of spiking. Okay, so it's just a correlation between the excitation, the magnitude of the input excitation, and the spiking frequency. Okay, so those are the neurons. The synapses get much more complicated. So I'll go back to the first slide and just mention it again. In a typical microprocessor, right, like the one that's in your computer, you probably have about 10 billion transistors. And that's about approximately how many neurons the adult human brain has in the neocortex, which is sort of the outer sort of folded up part inside of your head. Now, that's fine. But the thing is, if each one of those neurons connects to 10,000 other neurons, right? How many synapses do you have? You have something like 10 to the 14 synapses inside of your brain. And if you're going to try and build an electronic system that has these synapses, you know, you've got to come up with a device that's extremely dense. You know, you can make extremely densely packed in there because you need to have 10 to the 14 of these devices inside of your chip, right? And so one of the ways that we're looking at doing that is by using these, what we call memristors. Have y'all heard of memristors at all? Yes, no, kind of? No? No? Okay. Well, that's okay. They're basically two terminal devices. They're resistors essentially, but their conductance at any given time actually depends on past bias conditions. So you can apply a large pulse, say, to the, there's something in the chat. Okay, Kelsey hasn't either, but you can apply a large pulse to the device and change its resistive state, which they're going to be really useful for memory. So say Micron is actually producing these, and they had a joint project with Intel that ended a year or two ago that they called Crosspoint, right? Or Intel Micron, and it's a, and there was a hybrid memory cube and Crosspoint basically. And so it's these, this huge array of connections, you know, that are in parallel, and then you put another array of connections on top, and then you build a device at each cross point inside of this grid. And in that way, you can get extremely dense memory, right? And it's resistive. So based on, you'll have a 1 or a 0 based on whether the resistive state is really highly resistive or not resistive at all.
So these are still in development right now.
These are sort of still in development and sort of commercialized. It's a big area. They've been around for a very long time, decades actually. The challenge is in using these for digital memory. There are some challenges in terms of having to actually integrate in some current limiting and other issues. But yeah, some of them are in production, and some are also still in the research phase. So it sort of depends on what type of device characteristics you're looking for. But predominantly we use ones that are in the research, sort of the research phase that Dr. Chris Campbell fabricates. So maybe some of you have had her for a class or two. And you know, this is essentially what it looks like. If you were just to apply a sine wave voltage to this thing with a sufficient magnitude, as that sine wave actually goes higher, then it'll change resistive state to be less resistive. And so if you plot the current through the device as a function of the voltage across it, then you'll get sort of this hysteresis loop, right? It looks like a bow tie kind of. And so what is the instantaneous resistance, right? V equals IR. So the instantaneous resistance is V divided by I, or it's basically the slope, right? Well, so if the slope is here, the one with the bigger slope is less resistive. And the one with the really flat slope is highly resistive, more resistive, right? And what would a resistor look like? it would just be a straight line, right? And it doesn't matter, it goes through the origin and it's V equals IR. And so, you know, this is I versus V and the R is constant. So the slope is constant, okay? So with a memristor like this, you are applying a signal that causes a resistance change as you apply the signal, depending on what signal you've applied historically. It changes the resistance. And so you see the slope change as you're doing this, right? You get these bow tie curves or hysteresis curves. Okay.
So as you get more voltage, does the resistance of the memory resistor go down or increase?
Well, it depends on polarity, right? Basically. So it depends on how you orient the thing. But typically, you know, the way that you would usually do it is you apply a certain large enough voltage, it will decrease the resistance. And then you apply a negative voltage and it will increase the resistance back to its other state, right? So that's why, you know, the origin of this plot, as you can see, is right here where there's the pinch in the bow tie, right? The voltage has to go negative and positive. And if you were to stop at 0, let's say, after you've gone up the positive side and stop at 0 and then go back up, it's still going to have a low resistance. It's still going to be in a low resistance state until you reset it by going to a negative voltage. That make sense? Okay. So anyway, these are pretty cool. And you can model them pretty easily, typically by just sort of using some differential equations that define sort of the resistance state and of these two sort of back-to-back variable resistors. So you just pretend that this device has sort of a low resistance region and a high resistance region, and that the boundary between those regions can change depending on the voltage. It's really quite straightforward to define mathematically, and this was kind of described by Strukov back in 2008. This is, in general, the model that we use. And just to show you what that looks like, here's that very simple mathematical model. Is you have the applied voltage is just a sinusoid, right? And it's going up to about 0.75 volts or something like that, or maybe 0.7. And the current is the red one. And it's, if you had a resistor, you would just have a sinusoid here that's just perfectly in phase with your applied voltage, right? But when you have this memristor, suddenly you're getting a resistance change when the polarity of when the voltage magnitude goes higher, and so you get a very nonlinear, you know, big change in the current because you're changing the resistance in time. And so, you know, you can look at by plotting the current versus the voltage and get the same sort of look of a bow tie curve. Okay. Well, that's not very useful in terms of what I've talked about with the neural networks, right? They spike. And so let's look at what it looks like when you have spikes. So if you apply voltage pulses, basically, positive, negative, etc., then you're going to get changes in the conductance of the device. And the magnitude of those changes is going to depend on the magnitude of the voltage pulse you applied. Okay. So just look at, you know, positive pulse, then it kicks up. And then here at about almost 50 milliseconds, it's a negative pulse, and so it kicks back down, and et cetera, et cetera. Then there's a positive followed quickly by a negative at almost 100 milliseconds, so it kicks up and down. And then, of course, as you get over here closer to 450 milliseconds, there are larger magnitude pulses, and so there are bigger changes in the conductance of the device. So this is a lot like a synapse, essentially, right? I said that in the brain, the synaptic weight changes depending on the activity of the neurons that it connects. And so this memristor changes its conductance depending on the voltages that are applied on either electrode of the device. Okay. So that's pretty handy. And they're also extremely dense, you know, integration in terms of the number of devices per centimeter squared. And so I think it's cool too. And so that's predominantly what we are interested in using as a synapse. Okay, so let's look at the actual learning rules, which are the way that these synaptic weights change as a function of the activity of the neurons, right? One way is just, let's look at, say, firing rates, okay? And for a long time, the neuroscientists, back in the 70s really believed that all the information that is coming to our brain from the periphery, right? Say from our eyes, from our nose, from our sensors in our skin, was transmitted just based on the firing rates of the neurons. And so a firing rate is just basically the number of spikes that happen per amount of time. And you can build a network using a memristor connection, synaptic connection, that pretty easily implements a firing rate learning rule where N1 is the input and N2 is the output. And if N1 is firing faster than N2, the strength increases, right? The connection strength increases because, hey, neuron 1 is making the output neuron fire. So we should strengthen that connection. And vice versa, if neuron 2 is firing faster than neuron 1, maybe we should decrease the strength of that connection, right? Because the output neuron has more activity, more excitation than the input. So those two neurons are out of sync. We should try and weaken the connection. And so this is a pretty straightforward average firing rate learning rule. And there's actually some interesting things you can do with that. And one of those is Pavlov's, it's basically associative learning or classical conditioning. So Pavlov's dog experiment. Have y'all heard of that at all? Maybe taken an intro to psych class. It's like one of the first experiments you'll learn about in sort of like basic psych. If you present a dog food, they start to salivate when at the sight of food, right? And they will, because they're ready to eat. My dogs are like, oh, I'm ready to have a snack. I'm ready to eat. They're getting ready to get right on it. And if you consistently present food and ring a bell at the same time that you present food, right, for quite some time, and then take the food away and just ring the bell, they will start to salivate, even if there's no food there, because they've started to associate the fact that they're going to get food with the hearing the bell, right? So it's association learning, associative learning. Well, with an average firing rate learning rule, a very basic one, we can actually simulate that, where in this little 3 neuron network, you have a neuron A here, which represents the sight of food, a neuron B here, which represents the ringing of a bell, and then an output neuron, which represents like the salivation response. And the synaptic weights sort of start where the salivation response is always triggered by the sight of food, right? So we'll make the red neuron spike really fast and say, okay, yeah, the output spikes. And conversely, at the beginning, we'll make the green neuron spike really fast, which is the ringing of the bell, and that does not cause a response because there's no association at the beginning, right? Then you do both. You present food and ring the bell for a while together, and you see there's an increase in the weight here of weight B, and so then suddenly you turn off the sight of food and just the ringing of the bell will cause the salivation response. It's a very basic associative learning task that you can do in just a 3 neuron network with memristive synapses and this firing rate learning rule.
That's pretty interesting. On your 1 in out, sorry.
Yes.
What I'm seeing is after they stop doing the side of the food, it looks like the salivation response weakens and then increases.
Yeah, well, that's a consequence of the circuit, and because as you can see where it's sort of hidden here, I guess, but the trace is not of the green WB is not quite high enough to really make a strong response. But if we were to do the training for longer, where we do the red and the green for just longer, then it'll still increase the increase that weight, and you won't really see that little, yeah, you're right, it's kind of not quite as strong as it could be.
I just find it interesting because from what I'm getting from the graph, that implies that even though it's still not getting that sight of food, it's still the ringing of the bell is still becoming a stronger impulse even without the food.
Yeah, it kind of does there for a while. And actually, so it brings up an interesting point. And by the way, yeah, you can see that here, even in the top trace, which is sort of the average firing rate. There's sort of a drop right after you take out the side of food. But yeah, it actually, there's a lot more work on this in the paper that this was in. You know, we talked about forgetting and showed that it'll forget it eventually. You know, but for right there, it does obviously strengthen, and then yeah, it kind of keeps going. And in the real world, obviously, the dog would eventually forget. It's like, well, I'm not getting food anymore every time you ring this bell, so what's the point? But it's a very basic, you know, very basic stuff. What's more interesting is the fact that our brains mostly work on timing, right? We experience everything in time, temporally. You know, the way our eyes move, the way, you know, things, shapes, objects move within our field of vision, the way we hear speech and music and sounds, it's all with respect to time. And firing rates, in large part, take out a lot of the time component, right? Because you have to average a firing rate over some amount of time to get a number of spikes per unit time. And so there was a lot more work done in the late 90s and early 2000s that demonstrated that actually there's a lot of spike timing or a lot of changes in synaptic weight depending on spike timing. This is called spike timing dependent plasticity. And it's just the mechanism in which these connection strengths change depending on individual pre and postsynaptic action potentials. So these voltage spikes occur one right before the other, or pre right before post. That's an event that's that's an event that's sort of causal, right? I'm saying the input caused the output to spike, so let's strengthen the connection. And vice versa, if the output spikes right before the input, that was sort of out of sync, so we should weaken that connection. And so you can plot this just by looking at the timing of these of the postsynaptic and presynaptic action potentials and looking at the weight change. And this was done by Bai and Pu back in early 2000s. And this ends up becoming like a very common biologically realistic learning rule. Okay. And this is the one that we now mostly try to implement, because it causes what we refer to as the ability to recognize spatiotemporal patterns inside of a bunch of spike information. So spatiotemporal pattern recognition. So let me talk about that. So here's what you do. This is a scatter plot, or like a raster plot of 100 different neurons, right? Feeding into one output. So you've got 100 input neurons. They all just go through a synapse and feed into one output neuron. And what you do is you take those input neurons, and generally they just fire randomly, okay? But every once in a while, you let those input neurons fire a pattern. So the pattern is different for each input neuron, but it's the same every time that neuron fires the pattern, right? So for instance, the patterns, the spiking is each dot in this plot, and the patterns occur simultaneously, like a pattern will happen. And for neuron 100, it's just easier to see that its pattern is spike, 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 right? Something like that. And so here's the second occurrence is spike, 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 right? Okay, same thing. And then for, you know, this neuron 98 or something, it's spike, 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 spike. Okay. So you can see where these, hopefully, you know, it should have shaded them, and you'll see in the ones that I show in a minute, ours are shaded, but you know, you present this recurring pattern over and over and over. And it turns out that as you initialize the network, the output neuron just starts firing basically randomly at an almost constant rate, but just randomly. And if you just keep presenting this pattern over and over, the spike timing dependent plasticity that's happening in each of the synapses causes them to adjust their weights so that the output neuron only fires when it sees the pattern. So this is what it looks whoops, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute, but these are what the patterns generally look like. So how do we get spike timing dependent plasticity inside of a, inside of a neural network? In the case of the average firing rate thing, it was really just hooking two neurons up through a synapse. But it's much harder to get the timing dependence figured out if you're just using a memristor, right? It has no knowledge except for what's happening at the two terminals that it connects. So the way that you can do this is by, like, instead of using like a digital pulse from the neurons, you can use sort of these shaped pulses that have this sort of biphasic shape. And so you'll get potentiation, which is a strengthening of the connection, or depression, which is a weakening, depending on the action potential timing. So it's hard to design neuron circuits to generate these waveforms. And it also gives you purely pair-based STDP learning rule, which means each spike only considers the nearest neighbor spike in terms of adjusting its weight. And it turns out, and I'll talk about this at the very end, that there's in the brain, in reality, there's some combination of rate-based and timing-based learning that's happening. Like, it actually has, there's time constants associated with learning that actually change over time, oddly enough. So anyway, we simulate these networks, and we've built some of them as well that have pulse shapes that are sort of this biphasic shape, and then memristive synapses, and then a leaky integrate and fire output neuron, and show that they do STDP at some level, right? So here's the timing difference between the pre and post synaptic spikes. And this looks a bit like that biphasic shape that I showed you earlier. And then you can train these things in the same sort of way by timing correlation, by firing basically patterns within set windows. And you can also apply just actually random spikes and basically train these things to become a filter for a specific pattern. And in this case, we were showing it, we were trying to train it to become a B, Boise State B kind of a thing, right? Where this one is only 25 neurons, I believe, and this one's 100. And at the start, we've just initialized all of the synaptic weights to be exactly the same, okay? And then you kind of run this for a certain amount of time, and then, about 60 seconds in, you could say, or maybe even at 30 seconds in, there's not much of a change that happens. It takes about 30 seconds, which in this case is about 30 pattern presentations, for it to sort of learn the input, okay? There's a lot of graphs on here, but I'm not going to talk about them. But we can pull out the STDP plot and just confirm that the thing is doing this spike timing dependent plasticity. So let's not talk about that because it's boring. Let's look more at advanced learning approaches now. So I'm going to show you some more of this spatiotemporal pattern recognition, but using some different devices and different circuits. Okay, so I'm almost done here. I guess I've been going for 45 minutes, so I should try to be done. Here's what's that?
Oh, it's been great. There's a lot here.
Yeah, there's a lot here, yeah. I know, whoops. So here's sort of our approach to doing this, which is, let's, instead of trying to shape the voltage pulses coming to the memristor from either side and using these hard to generate biphasic action potentials, the idea is basically, instead, let's modulate the conductance path through the memristor itself. And the way that we do this was what we now call like an RFT approach, which is a time dynamic resistance element. And so you can use actually what is a transistor that, when you apply a voltage to the gate, actually charges up some some particles inside of the gate and decreases the conductance of the channel and then you remove the voltage at the gate, but the charge is still there. And so the channel actually stays conductive for some amount of time until all this charge starts to leak off. And so that gives us this sort of secondary time. You can actually tune depending on the leakiness of the device, right? So basically you pulse the gate, it charges the device up, and so the conductance path through the memristor it's really conductive for some amount of time. And then as that charge actually leaks off of this gate, this trapped part of the gate, then then suddenly it becomes more and more resistive, right? So basically we're creating a whole bunch of little time-dependent voltage dividers. We love voltage dividers in electrical engineering, don't we? I think we all do. And so you have a memristor that changes its resistance in time, and then you have another element that changes its resistance in time, and you can get a lot of really dynamic learning in this kind of a system. And there we go. I just want to show that we fabricated these. We actually fabricated some in the clean room at Boise State as thin film transistors that basically have like little nanoparticles of gold inside of the gate, which are the 10 nanometers in size that do the charge trapping and then kind of release it. And those things worked pretty well. It turns out that when you build this system using the TFT neuron circuits that I showed earlier, and this nanoparticle transistor and a memristor, they actually behave extremely close to biology. I think the best demonstration of this is on the right, and this is hard to see, but it's because there's so much data here. But the synaptic weight change has plotted as for triplets, basically. So you have like pre-post-pre-spike triplets or post-pre-post spike triplets. And the experimental or the data from, let's see, from this Wong paper is the boxes, okay? And our experimental results actually measuring this circuit are the stars. And for, let's see, the filled symbols are pre-post-pre triplets, and the open symbols are post-pre-post triplets that differ by 5 milliseconds, 10 milliseconds, and then 15 and 5, and then 5 and 15, if that makes sense. So these are kind of like, these are quick post-pre-post. These 10 and 10s are like post-pre-post. And then the 15 5s are like post-pre-post kind of triplets, right? And so they can actually make these happen in biology by connecting the cells and sticking tiny little needles into the cells to make them fire at the right times, and then measuring the synaptic weights. And the match here is pretty convincing. The star, which is our experimental data, is right under these, and then the star here sort of follows the same trend. The star here, and so the trend for each of these sets of data is actually pretty darn close to biology, which is really hard to do in electronics. It turns out you can then start to do a spatiotemporal pattern recognition task with these things. And there's a lot of data to show, but here's a similar raster plot where we've done a simulation of this same kind of network. And look at the output. It's firing randomly, and then after you keep presenting these patterns which occur during the shaded portions, right? You generally just start to get spikes that only occur during those patterns, right? So it's learned to recognize when those patterns occur, and almost only fires, other than a couple of false detections, almost only fires when that specific pattern has been presented to the inputs. So the last thing here is just to kind of say, well, look, now you can also extract the STDP data from that. And this scatter plot looks a lot like the one that I showed for the biological measurements, right? From this paper by Bai and Pu back in 2001. So it's clearly doing some kind of STDP, but this is in a system that uses electronic transistors and memristors. Okay. So lately, these are the last few slides. We've been trying to do this actually in CMOS so that we can get all this fabricated by a foundry, and we'll be actually sending it out for fabrication in a couple of weeks from now. And just to show that you build a circuit that mimics the behavior of the charge trapping transistor. So you do that by injecting charge onto a capacitor and letting it leak off, essentially. And it also does the same kind of spatiotemporal pattern recognition. So the output's on top, the shaded parts are the pattern. There's one false positive, but for this is only with 25 input neurons. And if you go to a larger number of input neurons, you're generally going to have fewer problems. So moving forward, we're doing a lot of sort of this time dynamic learning and doing spatiotemporal pattern recognition and purely spatiotemporal computing, basically, which is which is a way to sort of combine what you might think of as a digital computer and a neuromorphic processor. And instead of representing information as ones and zeros inside of a digital computer, you can represent information using a spatiotemporal pattern, right? Which allows you a lot more than just binary states, right? 0 or 1. Instead, if you have a spatiotemporal pattern, you could represent pretty easily 1 million different states, right? It's a very large, very extremely high dimension of representations instead of just ones and zeros. And there's pretty interesting ways that we're doing that, and we're not quite the first to sort of do it this way, but it's clear that the brain uses spatiotemporal patterns to transmit and represent information. And so, we're trying to do that by just breaking down all spatiotemporal patterns into 3 different elements, right? Which are timing differences between 2 inputs, timing differences between a single input, and coincidences. And we've designed circuits that basically can capture all of these cases. And so then you can combine those circuits almost into something that's kind of like an FPGA, right? It's programmable, it's reconfigurable in order to detect any given spatiotemporal pattern, which has been shown here in this paper we published last year. So with that, I better end. You guys are the only ones left, but I hope it was interesting. And if you have any questions, just let me know.
Oh, it's fascinating. John, do you have any questions?
I don't have any, but yeah, that was pretty cool though.
Yeah, it was quite fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on in this field.
Yeah,
it's a really, really hot area right now. And like, this is just a tiny little sneak peek into what we're doing. And you can tell we've done a lot of stuff, and it doesn't even scratch the surface of what, some of the things being done by IBM and Intel and even other university research groups. So
right.
It'll be a pretty exciting next 10 years. I don't think we'll have an artificial brain in 10 years, but there'll be some pretty interesting demonstrations of neuromorphic in the next 10 years. So.
Right.
Now you know a little bit about it, hopefully.
Yeah.
Okay.
One of the things I found fascinating, you said that each neuron has like 10,000 other ones connecting to it.
That's right. Yeah. That's the typical fan out in the brain. I mean, that's when when you see a diagram or a picture of a neuron, right? It's got all these little branching structures, these little dendrites, and those things, branch out over sometimes over up to millimeters, and connect to other neurons that are millimeters away.
They're going really far. Those things, their distance goes much greater than the actual body.
Well, yeah, and then the nerves in your body are essentially those parts of neurons, but they're covered in a fatty thing that in the brain they're fairly short range. But I mean, even a millimeter is pretty long range when you're talking about a 20 micron size cell, right?
Yeah.
But those, the nerves in your body are the connections of neurons, but they're covered in like a fatty substance called myelin that helps them transmit those voltage pulses over a much longer distance. But inside the brain, they don't have that. And so the voltage pulse will decay if it goes too far, right?
Mhm.
And far would be like a millimeter or two. So
That's when it has to get a replay or something.
yep.
It's all also
Okay.
Go ahead, John. Did you say something?
No.
No. Okay.
Okay.
I just found the leakage also interesting. And is that the leakage part of the time variance?
Probably. It's rather interesting, right? I mean, biology is very imprecise. I mean, it's very diverse, which means it's imprecise. And each cell in your body is nothing like any other cell. Each neuron is unique in terms of its shape, which means it has a different membrane capacitance. And then the way these things work is, it's a lipid bilayer membrane, just like every other cell in an animal. And they have little vesicles in them, basically these, little holes that allow through certain ions and then block other ions. And so these little vesicles, or these little ion channels, are what control the flow of charge into and out of the cell. And so there's potassium and calcium and sodium floating around. Okay.
Mhm.
And each cell has these ion channels that act as pumps, and they pump out. And I'm terrible, I should remember all of this, but I don't get. Neuroscientists would be able to tell you, a cellular neuroscientist, I think they usually pump calcium. They're constantly pumping it out of the cell to maintain a certain voltage, right, across the cell membrane. And then when they get enough charge injected into the cell, there are other ion channels that are voltage gated. In other words, they have a little protein on them that will open up the ion channel if the potential across the membrane is high enough. It's insane, right? I mean, that's biology, like, has a bioelectronic mechanism inside of our brains where these little ion channels will be squeezed off, and then, but if the voltage is high enough, they open up and they allow the flow of these ions through, right? Which generates the action potential, which sort of depolarizes, as we would say, the neuron. And then, of course, that depolarization causes those ion channels to close back up. And it all happens within the course of about a millisecond, which is super slow when you're talking about electronics, right? But in biology, that's about the typical time frame. So there's all these ion processes going on inside the brain, and each cell is going to have a different membrane capacitance. It's going to have a different number of ion channels that are embedded inside of the lipid bilayer membrane, and it's going to have different characteristics, basically. So the brain is incredibly robust for how imprecise it is, if that makes any sense.
That is pretty amazing. As you said, entire cells or areas of cells can just die off and you won't even notice it.
Yes.
Or a computer.
Yeah, and in fact, my student Sumedha, who just graduated this summer, was doing a really interesting study that I'm hoping to try and continue and find some funding for, because there's been some of it out there. But I mean, people know that, like, stroke victims can lose millions of cells and still essentially not lose any brain capacity. So there's not only it's just incredibly defect tolerant. There's basically this, like, built-in reliability, this built-in sort of backup, to a lot of what happens inside the brain. And we were doing a study of, kind of whether or not these electronic networks will be as reliable, if implemented with a memristor and STDP, and if a certain number of these input neurons die off, or break, essentially, as we're talking about it in electronics, like they just stop functioning. How detrimental is that to the network's ability to perform pattern recognition? And it was pretty amazing that we're trying to get this paper published right now, is that in some cases you could kill off a quarter of the neurons in the network, and it would still recognize spatiotemporal patterns regularly without any loss.
In electronical circuits.
in the electronic circuit, which means it is in some cases incredibly robust, and then in others, sometimes killing off a quarter of the neurons. It just depends on which neuron you end up killing. It would be detrimental. So, there's a lot there in terms of trying to figure out why the loss of some neurons matters more than others, and if you're going to implement this kind of a system, how to make it more robust, which would also answer questions that are trying to be answered in neuroscience in general. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sort of the thing of whether it was only a few of the neurons actually making it fire, or if it was sort of more spread out among them.
Yeah, it's sort of a question of that, but it's not exactly clear whether it's a timing. It's not clear which ones were more important and why, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, once you kill off like 50% of the inputs, then you're dead in the water. But I mean, killing off a quarter of the inputs in some cases is not detrimental, which is incredible to me, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm. Especially
that's
when you have so
completely,
many.
yeah.
Okay, well, John, do you have any other questions?
No, I don't have any questions.
Okay. Well, thank you guys. It was good to see you. I hope you're doing well.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
You bet. Good luck with classes and everything. And let me know if you ever think of any other questions.
Okay, cool.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.